very simply, I think for all of you, you are familiar with the sales policies handbook, right, that you put together for most sales organizations. You give that to the salesperson the first day they show up and say, these are your policies, which they never read, right? And then throughout the year, you're constantly spending time explaining to them how something that they're asking for is not in the policy. So this is a constant struggle that we encounter as sales operations teams. But in most cases, the policies some things are well understood. Like, for instance, thou shalt not sell into somebody else's territory. Right? That's a pretty well-defined territory that's unlikely to, or policy that's unlikely to change. But there's a lot of other things that govern data, for instance, right? Who can create accounts in the system? What fields are allowed to change throughout the year? How do you handle mergers and acquisitions? So these are all things that from a sales operations perspective, rules of the road, if you will, that you got to put in place in order to, one, predictably repeat the sales process, right? So things that can be measured, things that can be repeated over and over again, because that's really what you're trying to achieve. And most often than not, what we find is that these things tend to get hard-coded into your workflow processes. So that becomes a point of scale that starts to break down. And a great example, I met this sales ops person that had just started working with Salesforce, and he was super excited to go to a class to learn about Apex programming. That was fantastic. And I asked him, what are you trying to do with this, right? And he said, well, I've got this routing engine that we have built using Apex code. And he showed me the routing engine, and basically all of the zip codes have been hard-coded in code, right? So he's very excited to learn Apex so he can decode it and continue that practice. This is a great example of something where that separation between those things that change because your go-to-market changes versus the workflow, which is a process that typically doesn't change or evolves with the size of the company, but not very often. So these are things to kind of think about as we talk about policies. I mean, the holdouts is a great example of a policy, right? We change it by segment. I think somebody said at Salesforce it changes by whether you're an SMB or mid-market or whatever. Based on the sales cycle, you get more time to close a deal once the accounts change hands. So these are the kinds of policies that we think about when we say, okay, how do you shorten the time from planning to execution? What we find is that most people spend time adjusting these policies in their execution environment, and that's what takes a lot of time to kind of operationalize a new go-to-market, right? And so our proposal is that you separate workflow from the rules of the road, if you will, and be able to adjust the rules as you change your go-to-market plan. So that allows you to be a lot more nimble and really kind of shorten that time from planning to execution. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler, who's going to talk a little bit more in depth and give some examples and experiences that he's had working with customers. Tyler.
I've worked at Skilljar in a previous life as an SDR manager, as an account executive, as well as an SDR. I've been an account manager at an elevator parts company. So I've been around and been in different positions within the companies. So I've seen a lot of different processes and things that have, essentially to Bala's point around policies, the policies that have been hard-coded into a process. And so we're going to talk a little bit, we're actually going to break this down and attempt to make policies a little more friendly. And so John had essentially broke my my joke where we're all going to stand up and do jumping jacks because policies is kind of a boring subject sometimes. So, but the first thing we're going to talk about is just really trying to understand what a policy is and what we see as a definition of a policy, and then we'll get into some of those examples. But policies are essentially they govern how rules are implemented, and the rules themselves are what make up a policy. And so if we look around this room right now, the policy for this room might be that we want to exit safely. We want everybody to exit safely in an emergency. And so there's some rules that we've put in place that a lot of us don't really think about in the room, and that might be like the exit signs at the top of the door that illuminate if there is an emergency, or there's a certain occupancy per square footage of the size of room, so you can only have so many people in a room, right? And these are these rules that we've set in place to support our policy. And the easiest way to define a policy or put it into a sentence is really, it's a set of principles that help guide our decisions to a predictable outcome. And so when we look at our example here with this room, the principles or the rules of making sure the occupancy is not too high and we've got exit signs will help guide our decision, so we're not going to fill the room up too high. We're going to make the decision in an emergency to follow the exit signs into a predictable outcome, which is safety. So that is a policy boiled down into one simple sentence. Another way to look at this is also traffic management. We'll get to the sales ops stuff, but I like real-world examples because it helps make sense of this notion of policy. And so a traffic policy might be something like getting quickly as we can to a destination as well as safely, and making it safe for everybody on the road. That could be bicyclists, that could be pedestrians and other cars, as well as truck drivers, anybody that's on that road. And so there might be some rules that we have that we will put in place to help support that policy. And those rules could be things like stop signs or speed limit signs, and a yield sign, traffic, road lanes, a lot of different things that we have on these roads that we follow, all support our policy of getting as quickly as we can through our streets while being safe. So the important piece here where we talk about our rules and extracting them, Bala had kind of talked about this, which is like extracting these rules from a hard-coded process or a workflow. And if we look at these signs here, which are all set as rules, they're actually pulled out from the process of driving, right? So the process of driving is getting in your car, turning the ignition on, stepping on the gas pedal, and going about your day. And these rules here can change depending on the conditions of the road. So as a road becomes busier, we might need to turn it from a yield sign into a stop sign. And then as it becomes even more busy, we might turn it from a stop sign to a traffic light. So we can see how it can adapt to the conditions over time. And much like in a business environment, when we see that a business condition is changing, if these things aren't hard-coded into the workflow rule, we can easily change them on the fly and make it easily adaptable to the changing business condition. So another great example is chess. Now you can imagine that we're all kind of sitting here and we're in this chess game together. It's us versus Bobby Fischer. And all of us are all on the same team, right? We're guaranteed to lose, but we're going to give it our best shot. So if we all had a general strategy, so maybe our strategy was we're going to play chess aggressively. We're going to make aggressive moves, but we're not going to set any policy, right? So let's say that like finance team in the sales ops world, the finance team sets a strategy or gives us a number. In our chess world, maybe the super coach, which is Bala, gives us the strategy of we're gonna make aggressive moves here, and we're gonna go after this win. And now the sales leaders are deciding these movements. So all of us are kind of thinking about movements, but we've got maybe a couple of leaders that are really picking and choosing the movements of what the whole team should follow. And one by one, all of us will make one movement. So I'll come up to the table, I'll make the movement, I'll move a pawn up, and then somebody else comes up, they're going to move a rook, and then we'll move a castle, and so on and so forth. And yes, we do know about the overall strategy of we want to make aggressive moves, but we haven't really set any policy in place around what those movements should look like. And so if we actually had set policies or a policy around specific moves that we want to make or rules, things like pushing pawns to hold back attacks or attacking with rooks or castle king, these policies can help guide our decisions in this game. So now all of a sudden I know that in a given move that I can make, I should follow some of these rules that support our policy of this aggressive attack in the middle game, end game, whatever position we're in. But in general, I can come up, I can make a move, and I can leave, and somebody else from this room can then make a similar move that's in alignment with the policy and rules that we've set. And you know what? Then maybe we might have an attempt at beating Bobby Fischer. That would be great. I don't know if anybody's heard of, knows anything about chess, but Bobby Fischer is like one of the world's greatest chess players. And there was actually a book out a while ago that it was just actually funny that I recently read this, and so I think that's why I picked this topic. But it's The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin, and was known it's a pretty good book also. It's called Searching for Bobby Fischer, which Josh Waitzkin was essentially the protege of Bobby Fischer. So something, if you're ever interested in chess, it's a really good book. But so let's talk about how this actually relates to sales operations. So most of our teams, we don't have you could say that we don't have our planning aligned to our execution. So we're over here, finance and sales, we're building out plans, we're doing stuff in Excel, we're setting all this stuff up. There's no real policy guiding things. We've got a strategy, right? We know what we want to do, but we're not setting a policy and rules to really help enforce that plan or that strategy throughout the rest of the organization. So when we talk about to the execution piece. So we give this plan to the CRM admins. And the CRM admins go in and they're executing and they're making rules, they're implementing the ownership changes, but the policy itself hasn't really been set. And so much like in our chess example, nobody's telling us what exact moves we need to make. So each CRM admin's making their own moves, right? Well, I'm going to implement lead routing through workflow rules or in Apex. And another CRM admin is like, I'm going to make ownership changes through a mass update using data loader or whatever it might be, right? And so, or another one's like, well, we should use account teams. And if we've had policies here to help guide our decisions within the team, we can all stay aligned to what the strategy was put in the first place. And so as we go, CRM admins execute, sales team starts following the plan. So we're running as fast as we can. We're following this plan that's been put in place. And as we go, things are changing. So conditions are changing. Much like our chess game, Bobby Fischer all of a sudden makes an offensive move. And now we're put on the defense. And so our aggressive tack has been checked, right? And so we've got to think about how are we going to adapt to this. And so in sales ops, we've got new market segments that come in. We brought in a new product 6 months in. We've hired a couple of new AEs because a couple of them churned out. And so we've got to figure out how to adapt to that. And that's where those policies and the rules come in place because they help guide us in making these decisions. So where we don't have a policy or a rule, a sales leader might say, okay, well, we're going to start routing leads to an SMB team that we're going to build. And it's going to be 250 employees and below. And so CRM admin's going to go in and make a rule that just says, well, if a lead comes in and the employee is 250 or below, route it to this SDR team, round robin it. But what we didn't do is actually look at all of the potential scenarios that happen. And so that's what all these rules that need to happen within lead routing to support our policy, which might be something like we want to route leads to the right person. And there are rules, and we looked at these in the demo, but the rules could be we want to route it to a specific account owner if the account is a customer, or we want to route it to an AE if it's a prospect account. And if it doesn't exist, then we want to round robin it to the right team based on employees. So then we also need to think about the rules about making sure that we have employees in the system. And so there's all these different rules that we need to think about. And we don't want to hard code them into this workflow either. We won't want to say, like, in Apex that if it has this, or then do this, because we might want to change those rules later on, much like building out a new team. We go to market. We have an enterprise team, and then the rest is what we would just consider mid-market, right? And all of a sudden, now we have this SMB team, and we need to be able to adapt quickly. And we need to be able to route these leads accordingly. So all of this stuff that's coming in, and we're all making one-off rules. We're just plugging holes, right? We're configuring stuff in the CRM. We keep adding rules on top of things. I'm routing these SMB leads to the SMB team. We hire somebody new in. We want to start breaking up the SMB team now via geography, but we got to think about all these other rules that we've put in place in the CRM first. And as we're just kind of making all these changes, there's gaps that start to happen and things start breaking. And we call it ops hell. In the planning world, you'll see multiple Excel versions or multiple data loads as you're trying to fix account ownerships, and an AE leaves and you're trying to put in another AE's name, but no policy has been set around that. You've got never-ending manual CRM configuration, so much like what I was talking about before, where you're just trying to plug these holes in your CRM, and you're just making these one-off rules. If you don't take that time to really zoom out and understand what your policy is and all of the rules that need to be in place to support it, you'll hit this ops hell. And I have lived it. It's okay to laugh. So what is our goal? Our goal is continuous planning to execution alignment. I think that this has probably been talked about, maybe even beat to death today, but this is what it's all about. We want to take our plan or our strategy, and we want it to be perfectly aligned with the execution. And policies is how we're going to do that. Because if we go back to planning, not having a policy, implementing the plan, and maybe we have a great sales ops team, and they implement this plan perfectly to a T, right? But that's still not going to account. If we don't set these policies up front, it's not going to account for the things that are going to happen later on. We're going to need to make changes to this plan. It's going to happen. People leave, we miss numbers, or maybe we're doing really great, so the number changes, and we need to hire more people. Like all of these little different nuances that happen throughout a year, we need to stay in sync between planning to execution. And if it's not in sync, we're going to fall behind as a business. So policy-based approach to sales ops. The policy-based approach to sales ops aligns everyone to the same business goal. So planning. We define the strategic goals of the plan. We incorporate dynamic considerations, and we define current and future states. So we're looking at our plan, and we're going, okay, well, what could this look like today, and what could this look like 6 months from now in our policy? And I'm going to keep going back to this, the lead routing, because I like it. But we could say that today we're just going to round robin leads. That's it. We have a small SDR team, but we have ambitious goals that we want to get an enterprise AE hired 6 months out. And so we're actually going to hire an SDR with that, right? And we want to make sure that the leads are going to get routed accordingly when we get that set up. And so as we think about our plan in the future, we actually want to make sure we're ready for that in that policy. And so we will look at these rules and go, okay, well, let's set that up now. Let's get ready to route leads to an enterprise rep or an enterprise team now. But we'll actually assign those to the current team, and as soon as we actually have that hire ready, we just flip a switch. It's really easy. But and that comes back into this execution here. So we will set the guidelines for execution, and it decentralizes decision making. So we set these policies, and we could take data governance for an example. So we say that, well, okay, all of the billing countries, they need to be spelled out. We can't have U.K. We can't have UK. We can't have United Kingdom. We can't have Britain. We can't, whatever other acronyms we can think of, but we're going to spell out United Kingdom every single time, right? And as people are adding accounts into the system, because you're going to have different people adding accounts, the policy that we've set is these things need to be spelled out. And maybe there's a rule that enforces it, like a validation rule in Salesforce or something like that we've set in place. But all of a sudden, people can make these decisions on their own about, I can add this account, know that the data is going to be correct, and later on down the line, when we're actually planning again, we don't have to worry about the fact that all of the come on in, the UK, United Kingdoms, and all of these counts in the systems don't have all the data that's aligned, right? And then we've got to go through the whole process of like fixing all this stuff and getting ready to do the main part of the planning. But so here's this approach, and this is how we want to think. The traditional approach, and we've talked a little bit about it, which is routing these leads to an SMB team. So we hire this SMB team. We've got 200 to 1,500. We want those leads that come in, and we want to route them to the SMB sales team. So this is just a one-off rule, right? We just have this rule. We're going to create a workflow in Salesforce, and this is how we're going to do it. But we don't actually think about anything else that's pertaining to it. We don't think about the fact that, well, maybe we need to have employees in the field, or what do we do with all the other leads? Well, how do leads get created? What are other minimum data requirements that we need to have in place? And so these are all these things that go into a policy. Policy is a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. Like, it is a ton of work to do up front, but when you have it done up front, you've now enabled your team to make these decisions, so much like we were talking about earlier, where it decentralizes this decision making. It enables your team to make these decisions on your own. And then you can now free up your time to think strategically and not constantly plugging holes. And so policy-based approach, sales leader comes up and says, we're going to do a SMB team. We want to route all of our leads, 200 to 1,500, to this new team. Great, Mr. or Mrs. Sales Leader. What else should we consider here? So let's define our policy. What do we want to do with all these other leads? What's the exact sizing of each of these segments? So leads above 1,500, what segment is that? Is that all just enterprise? Do we have another segment? What about below 200? What are we going to do with those? What happens when there's no employee value? Who do we route that to? How are these things getting enriched? Where are they coming from? Are they coming inbound? Are reps adding them? And how are they adding information into the leads? And so we can set rules like all the leads that are created need to have employee information in it. And it needs to be enriched from a third-party data source. And when they do come in, we're going to look at this employee number, which we've extracted from this workflow. It's not in the workflow itself. We've just defined it up here. And maybe that's like in Salesforce speak, it might be like a process builder that you've plugged that information into the process builder that's passing that into a workflow or a flow that maybe you've built that would then read that information and route it to the right person. So you're Your process itself stays the same. The information that you have can adapt to the changing business environment. So policy-based approach, summary here. It builds a framework for growth into decision making. As we grow, things change. Policy and rules need to adapt. It forces the sales ops team to abstract the strategy, so essentially just understanding what that strategy is and putting it into place. We align our plan thinking to execution decisions. So going back to our lead routing, we've got, we want to break up our territories into 3 different territories: enterprise, mid-market, SMB. So we're going to align that plan to the execution decision that we're going to make, which is routing these leads. Guides future decisions. So we might set a policy around holdouts, right? And the holdout policy might actually be different for enterprise, the enterprise team versus SMB. You might even just say, you know what, there's no such thing as a holdout policy for SMB. You guys, you guys figure it out on your own. But within the enterprise, we might have set a policy around holdouts, and there might be specific rules. So if this opportunity looks like this, or if it's in this territory, and we need to share it with this other person, this is what you would do. And we've set these rules up to help guide our decisions for anything that happens in the future. It uncovers hidden dependencies. Routing leads, we're going to look at employees. We need employee data. If we just go and implement the rule of routing these leads without thinking about other things, we're not even going to think about the fact that, oh, well, what happens if a lead doesn't have employees' information in it? Or what happens if we decide that we're going to break up territories by industry? What happens if we don't have an industry piece of data in that account? Like, how are we going to deal with that? And so policy-based approach, as we lock these things down, they're going to uncover hidden dependencies, and they're going to find these little gaps that we're always trying to plug. And then avoid spaghetti decision-making. We're going back to our chess example. We don't have any policy put in place. We just know we need to get aggressive. And I come up, and I make this move. John comes up. He makes a move. And now Bobby Fischer all of a sudden makes his move, and it's an offensive one, and now we're on the defense, right? And so now, because there's no policy outlining what move we need to make, we're going to be like just kind of randomly just trying to make moves, and all of a sudden this overall strategy that we're going towards, this strategy of being aggressive, attacking, we want a castle with, I don't even remember what it was, a castle with a queen or something like that. But anyway, that goes out the window. We're just trying to fight for our life, right? We're plugging holes in the CRM, and we're doing whatever we can to keep things together. And that's where that spaghetti decision-making comes in, because we don't have a framework to make these decisions, which is our policy. The future. So the practical thing that everyone can take away is, we're going to talk a little bit about what we think the future is. And the future itself is just this software-defined operations idea, right? But the immediate takeaway is, when I go home tonight, what practical things can I do to take this policy-based approach? And it sounds really boring, but it's a document. And much like what Bala is talking about, like the salespeople aren't going to necessarily read these documents, but you can start with a document. You can start documenting your rules in a policy doc. So a lead routing policy doc might have different rules underneath it, all documented out. Leads must have employees. Leads must have an email address. Leads that come in with this need to get routed here, etc. And so you can start there. And then that could be that guiding framework for your sales ops team to implement those things in process builders, flows, et cetera. All right? But to the future and beyond. So software-defined sales ops is here. It is no longer necessary for us to operate at the configuration level. So much like what I was talking about with the practical piece, where we're building these policy docs and we're implementing this and we're configuring, the nice thing about taking this even a step further is being able to define our policies in software, right? What we're able to do is when we've extracted these policies out, we can immediately use software to define them in a planning tool, right? And software-defined sales operations execution can abstract the policy from the plan and then directly enforce it into the CRM. So it's the same theme that we've talked about. We've actually pulled these rules out from the flows or the workflow that we've put in place, and we've put them in a policy doc that guides these decisions, and then we've now put them, we've extracted them from the plan and we've put them into a piece of software. So in the case of Fullcast, we have an application layer that takes the planning policy and we implement it. So the benefit of linking planning to execution through planning. It's alliteration almost. It enforces planned decisions. So we've made this decision that we are going to use, try to think of something different than employee segmentation. But we've decided that we want to segment based on industry, right? We're going to go after the manufacturing sector. And we need to think about, well, how are we going to segment that out? What do leads, what do accounts, what sorts of information do they need to have to support this plan, right? And as we build these policies out, we're helping enforce our plan and the decisions that we make in the plan within the CRM. It helps us scale as the plan changes. I need to add another, or I want to break manufacturing down into two separate things. Manufacturing of electronics and then the rest, right? And so that's 6 months down the road. We make this decision, and we need to scale this quickly. It's an easy change in our policy to adapt to that. Enables a plan to execution agility, much like what we just talked about, and enforces sales compliance. So as we're implementing all of these policies and these rules in the system, the salespeople have to follow them. So when you're creating an account and you need to have an industry in there and you've enforced a validation rule to make sure that the industry is in there, you're not going to be able to create an account unless it's got it. And so we're enforcing these compliance as we go. So come planning time next year, we're not having to spend $100,000 to get all of our data right.